Before we get started, I wanted to let everybody know that I have a new book that is available on Kindle, and it is called Recommended Reading for the True Conservative. 50 pages long, and if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read it for free. Other than that, it's $3.99. So again, that is Recommended Reading for the True Conservative. And now, on with the podcast.
My wife does have sex, she screams. Ooh, especially when I walk in on her. Now, you kid, I know my wife cheats on me. Every time I come home, the parrot says, quick, out the window, you know? My house, I can't relax. Really? I got a dog. He drives me nuts. I got a dumb dog. You know, we call him Egypt. Every room he leaves a pyramid. My kids, they don't help either.
No good, huh?
Ooh, no, my kids, they're real smart kids I got, you know. Yeah. But the other day I told my kid, I said, someday you'll have children of your own. He said, so are you. Mean kid, a very mean kid. He scotch tapes morning to the sidewalk, then watches the birds get hernias. Are you kidding me?
Mean kid.
Mean kid. And my daughter, too, she's no bargain either, my daughter. You kidding? Well, she's been picked up so many times, she's starting to grow handles. I mean, you're kidding. Her graduation book, her picture is horizontal. It's ridiculous. My daughter, they call her Federal Express, you know.
What's that?
Yeah, when she goes to a guy's apartment, she absolutely positively has to be there over. I mean, that's the trouble with kids. They play around so young today, very young. I was talking to my doctor. You know my doctor, Dr. Finney Boombach. You know my doctor? Well, he told me last week in his office he got 6 cases of VD. I mean, he's all right now, you know. Oh, he's a strange doctor.
Strange doctor.
Oh, you kidding? I asked him if my heart was strong enough for sex. He told me not if I join in, you know. Oh, it's right, Doc. But everyone wants love. Love is the answer, Johnny. Everyone's looking for love, deep love, a lifetime of deep love, you know. I'm looking for a shallow half hour, you know. I start strong, then I peter right out. That's
Don't you have luck with
I
women?
never had luck with women. I'm no ladies' man. I know that, Johnny. I never got girls when I was a kid in show business either, you know. Well, one girl told me, come on over. There's nobody home. I went over. There was nobody home.
Good morning. It's Monday, Cold War Monday, June the 1st, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Varney and Company, motivation, meditation, and the Cold War. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Hi, good morning, Cheryl. Good morning, everyone. Here we go again. The war continues. Oil at $90 a barrel, $4 gas, but the explosive rally, it just keeps going. We will hit new highs within minutes of the start of trading today. Look at the Dow. It has gone from 41,000 a year ago to 51,000 now. It closed at a record last Friday. Looks like another intraday high coming within minutes. As for the S&P, most of our market analysts on this program believe it'll hit 8,000 by the end of the year. And the Nasdaq, clearly bolstered by AI and tech companies, has been like a rocket. Oil, we have that at around $89 a barrel, just dropped below $90. Bitcoin, that has not followed the stock trend. It is in the low 70,000 range, 72.1 right now. Interest rates, not much change. The 10-year still under 4.5%, and the 2-year is still right around 4%, 4.03. War news. The U.S. and Iran exchanged attacks. They're skirmishing, but the talks continue. The president said he is making progress slowly but surely, his words. Netanyahu says Israel will extend the fighting against Hezbollah into the suburbs of Beirut. Politics. The Democrats are developing a new attack line. They want to pack the Supreme Court so they can reverse recent conservative judgments. Not sure how popular that would be. It's like changing the court because you lost in court. There are new revelations in the case of Graham Plattner, who is the Democrat candidate for the Senate in Maine. There are new messages that Plattner reportedly exchanged with women outside his marriage. At least one senator, Cory Booker, he thinks Plattner has to answer a lot more questions. A near riot overnight at an immigrant detention center in Newark, New Jersey. Radical protesters want to shut it down. State troopers helped control the crowd. That's a change. In previous disturbances, local police stayed away. And then there's this. A riot in Paris after the European Championship soccer final between Arsenal from London and PSG from Paris. 780 arrests. This is strange. A riot in France after the French team won on a penalty kick shootout? Extraordinary. Monday, June 1st already. Times go real fast when you get older. Varney and Company.
About to begin. Nonprofit news now. Back in a minute. Thank you. Liberals are often allergic to exposure. When they cause harm, whether through manipulation, betrayal, or neglect, they know on some level that they've crossed a line. But admitting that, even to themselves, would crack the illusion they built around their superiority. So instead of engaging in the messy, humbling process of repair or reflection, they vanish behind a wall of silence. They stop responding. They disappear, and their absence speaks volumes. What makes this silence so potent is that it leaves conservatives suspended in a state of psychological confusion. We're left trying to make sense of the sudden emptiness, replaying conversations, analyzing our actions, and searching for closure. But the liberals' silence is not accidental. It's strategic. It denies us clarity. It leaves us in the dark. Because from their perspective, that disorientation serves a purpose, keeps them protected, and we're disempowered by not acknowledging what happened. They never have to explain, apologize, or take responsibility. That silence becomes a way to avoid shame. It's as if by not speaking the harm into existence, they believe they can erase its reality. This is a defense mechanism rooted in their fragile ego structure. Liberals are often deeply ashamed people, though they rarely show it. Their silence is not a sign of strength. It's a refuge from the overwhelming threat of having to look at themselves honestly. Shame is one of the most painful emotions a person can feel. It's different from guilt. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. Liberals can't afford to feel that. Their whole identity is a fortress built to keep shame out. So when they hurt somebody and are faced with the emotional consequences, silence becomes their armor. If they speak, they might slip. If they engage, they might be forced to admit fault. If they listen, they might have to feel. So instead, they choose absence. And here's where it becomes even more manipulative. The silence doesn't just protect them, it also punishes us. Liberals understand, often instinctively, that silence causes emotional distress. It creates a vacuum where validation, reassurance, and healing are supposed to be. In healthy relationships, silence after conflict is a temporary pause, something used to de-escalate or reflect. But with liberals, it's weaponized. It's used to reassert control. If they want you to chase them, to question yourself, to feel destabilized, because in that chaos they regain power. They also know that silence gives them the upper hand in the narrative. While you're left wondering what went wrong, they get to rewrite the story in their mind, free from contradiction. They might tell themselves you were overreacting, that you deserved it, or that they had no choice. They create a mental version of events that keeps them blameless, and silence gives them the space to solidify that story without interference. Furthermore, silence can be a way of resetting the dynamic. After a period of no contact, the liberal might return as if nothing happened. No apology, no explanation, just a resumption of the previous connection, expecting us to move on without closure. This reinforces their power. It teaches us that our pain doesn't warrant acknowledgement and that their withdrawal is something we have to tolerate. In this way, silence conditions the relationship. It becomes a behavioral tool that trains us to suppress our needs, to avoid conflict, to fear abandonment. There's also a deeper psychological reason why silence is so appealing to the liberal. It allows them to maintain the illusion that they are in control, not just of the situation, but of themselves. Liberals hate being seen as emotionally vulnerable. Speaking would reveal too much. Explaining would mean exposing their motives. Engaging would require empathy, and that is a risk. So they remain quiet. They remain quiet, composed on the outside, while internally defending themselves from an emotional world they do not know how to navigate. This is why silence can feel so cruel. It's not natural. It's charged with meaning. It's reflection of the liberals' internal chaos projected onto the relationship. It's their way of saying without words that your feelings are inconvenient and that our suffering is irrelevant and that our humanity is something they refuse to engage with. Dehumanization protects a fragile ego. Liberals operate from a place of deep psychological vulnerability, masked by an exaggerated sense of superiority. At their core lies a fragile self-concept, unstable, inflated, and easily threatened. To maintain this illusion of perfection and control, they must constantly reinforce the idea that they are superior to others. One of the most efficient ways they achieve this is by dehumanizing the people around them, especially those they've hurt. By stripping others of their complexity, feelings, and individuality, the liberal avoids the emotional burden of empathy, remorse, or accountability. When a liberal hurts you, your emotional response, pain, confusion, grief, represents a direct threat to their internal world. Your humanity forces them to recognize that they caused real damage to a real person, someone who had expectations, trust, and genuine emotional investment in their relationship. But acknowledging the truth would force them to see themselves not as the victim or hero of their narrative, but as the one who inflicted harm. That's a level of self-awareness they can't tolerate. So instead, they diminish our emotional reality. They convince themselves, and sometimes even others, that our reactions are exaggerated, irrational, or manipulative. This process of emotional minimization allows them to separate themselves from the consequences of their actions. If we are not fully human in their eyes, if we're merely dramatic, weak, needy, or disposable, then they don't have to feel bad for what they've done. They don't have to take responsibility. In their world, our pain is either irrelevant or deserved. It becomes a justification for their behavior rather than a reflection of it. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Dr. Berg.
Hey, Dr. Berg here. In this video, we're going to talk about the big zinc mistake. I should put an S after that because there's 4 big mistakes. Why am I even talking about zinc? Because without zinc, you will die. Zinc is so important for so much of your biochemistry because literally 200 to 300 different enzymes require zinc. Let's dive into the first mistake, and number 1 is taking too much zinc. On several videos, I recommend taking a lot of zinc, between 150 to sometimes 200 milligrams of zinc. Zinc and copper work together. In fact, they compete with each other in absorption. When someone's taking too much zinc, they're actually depleting copper. There's a really simple solution. Just take copper with your zinc. The ratios of zinc to copper is like 10 to 1. So let's say you're taking 30 milligrams of zinc, you would take 3 milligrams of copper. There's something else really interesting about this. There's a paradox related to the immune system. When you take a lot of zinc, it can help your immune system. When you take a lot of zinc, it can hurt your immune system. And it's simply certain parts of the immune system are benefited from a lot of zinc, but other parts are benefited just with the right amount of zinc, not too much. If you have an inflammatory infection of any kind, I would definitely want to take at least 100 to 150 to 200 milligrams of zinc for 3 days. Only if you're taking high amounts for weeks and weeks and weeks or months, then you're going to find part of your immune system might be suppressed. Anytime you're getting zinc from foods, you do not have to worry about what I just talked about. I'm only talking about taking zinc supplements in higher amounts. Let's move to number 2. There's no cofactors taken with zinc. Cofactors are nutrients, vitamins, and minerals to allow for our biochemistry to work. This is why when someone's deficient in zinc, they lose their hair. They lose their sense of smell and taste. They can no longer make testosterone. They no longer have libido. Their immune system can no longer function. When it comes down to zinc, there's some really key nutrients that you need in order for zinc to actually work. The first nutrient is magnesium. If you're deficient in magnesium, zinc is not going to work for you. This is another reason why I am really against just taking one nutrient in high amounts for a long period of time. You want connected nutrients to allow it to work and not to create problems. Another really important cofactor for zinc is B6. It is the activator for magnesium, for the neurotransmitters that affect your mood. It's involved in the menstrual cycle. So if you're deficient in B6, you may have PMS, even in the carpal tunnel right here. This is why one of the remedies for carpal tunnel syndrome is vitamin B6. Why? Because it gets rid of fluid retention and inflammation. Also, folate. Folate is involved in making red blood cells, making DNA, preventing inflammation in your arteries. You need some folate for zinc to work. Let's move on to number 3, not knowing when you are deficient. Yes, you can look on your nails and occasionally you'll get those little white specks that mean that you're deficient in zinc, but there's a much better way. And it's basically called the zinc test. You can buy these little bottles of zinc and you put some in a teaspoon and you put it in your mouth and you swish it around. You don't swallow it. What you're doing is you're just seeing if you can taste it. It's kind of a metallic, strong taste. If you are deficient in zinc, it will not taste like anything. It'll just taste like water. That brings up the question, is what foods are high in zinc and trace minerals? A lot of these trace minerals are in the sea. So anything seafood, shellfish, seaweed is all high in zinc and trace minerals. When you get your zinc from shellfish or oysters or even red meat or liver, it is much better than plant-based trace minerals. Number 4, taking too little zinc, okay? Well, that's just as bad as taking too much. When you consume grains, you get phytic acid. Phytic acid blocks zinc. And this is one reason why a lot of children are deficient in zinc, because they consume a lot of cereal with grains. Next thing is diarrhea. If you have diarrhea, you're going to lose a lot of zinc because you start losing not just zinc, but also sodium and other minerals as well. Not having enough stomach acid is very bad for absorbing minerals because you can't absorb minerals if your stomach acid is not strong enough. We need stomach acid to break down protein, but we also need the stomach acid to absorb minerals. As we age, our stomach acid goes down, 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 down. We can't digest protein and we can't get these key nutrients that we need. Drinking alcohol depletes you of zinc. Being pregnant or having too much estrogen when you're on birth control pills increases the need for zinc. This is why, like, diabetics, for example, are nearly always deficient in zinc because they have high levels of sugar in their blood. Let's say, for example, someone's addicted to pornography. There's a big chance they will become zinc deficient because semen has a lot of zinc contained in it. The average person needs a lot more because of all these other factors that increase the demand for that key trace mineral. To create a therapeutic effect, you need at least 30 to 40 milligrams per day. That's what I recommend because there's so many things that increase the demand for zinc. The more exercise you do, the more zinc you're going to need. The more muscles you have, the more zinc you're going to need. Zinc is also needed to heal wounds. This is why zinc carnosine is the best remedy for ulcers. Even like diabetic ulcers can be remedied by zinc. Where should you get your zinc? Well, I think you should start eating foods high in zinc, red meat, shellfish, liver, oysters. There's a lot of different types of zinc, but there's one type that I like more than others, and that would be a zinc amino acid chelated remedy, like a zinc glycinate. You get more absorption. Should you take zinc with your meals or an empty stomach? Ideally, take it when you eat. However, you can still take it on an empty stomach. It will still work. I take mine on an empty stomach because I do a lot of fasting, but you'll get just a little bit more absorption if you consume it with your meal. Now that you know the zinc mistakes, there's some amazing additional benefits.
And that was Dr. Berg. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, motivation.
What controls our focus controls our life. And everything's trying to get our focus all the time, right? Advertisers trying to get our focus. Your phone's ringing. In your pocket, it's buzzing. And that buzz is either your phone or it's an email or it's a text. There's this constant something trying to get control of our focus. But what you focus on determines your destiny in your life. So if you don't take control of it, somebody else will.
If I don't finally get my focus in check, if I keep wandering around distracted, if I keep looking at every new thing that pops up, if I keep trying every single new opportunity, if I keep saying yes to everything, if I keep listening to everybody's complaints, and if I keep doing whatever they ask me to do, at some point, you'll lose your life.
You can lose track of the long-term goal. It fades from your vision. It slips from your mind. But I don't accept that. I want that long-term goal to be so embedded in my mind that I never lose sight of it, ever.
You need to have a mission for what you're doing today. You should figure out what is it you desire in life and figure out the steps to get there and start working a plan to get there and minimizing everything else. Getting very clear on the mission, and working the plan. Everything else, guess what it gets? A no.
Every day, do something that moves you toward that goal, that keeps that goal alive and in sight and in focus. However small or insignificant that step might seem, take it, do it, make it happen.
Where will you be in your business and your life in 36 months? Not because you hope, because you decide. If there's something you once envisioned and now it's real, it's because you focused on it continuously, didn't you? When you focus on something continuously, something magical happens. You get insights, don't you? You overhear a conversation and you hear something you wouldn't have heard if you didn't have that outcome or goal that you wanted so badly.
What are the things that are stealing your focus? Who are the people that are stealing your focus? And begin to eliminate these distractions. Get laser focused and obsessed on what you want. Be starving and hungry to get it. Be desperate to get it. The combination of desperation and hunger with laser focus over an extended period of time is the formula to be great at something.
The question you want to ask yourself is, what do I want? The target is not the activity. The activity can change. It's what's the result I'm after. Clarity is power. The more clear you are in specifically what you want, the faster your brain can get you there. Because your brain's like a servo mechanism in a missile. It locks onto the heat signature. What does it do? It moves and follows it. That's the way your brain is if it knows the outcome, if it knows the result.
You cannot accomplish what you have not focused on. If you're not focusing on it, it can't happen. You're so focused on everything else but you, and you don't realize you are what's going to blow you up. You are what's going to change your situation. You are what's going to take you to the next level. Stop focusing on 4 things at once, and I need you to concentrate on one thing at a time. And most of you in this room, you can't give up 6 months. You can't give up 8 months. You can't let stuff go for a few weeks. Like you can't let girls go. Some of you just can't let boys go. Some of you just can't let parties go. Let it go. If you want to be successful, if you want to dominate in the area, you got to let everything go but that thing you're pursuing. You can't chase 2 rabbits and catch both of them. So you put your attention on one and go after it. You got to stay focused. Stay focused. Stay focused on the goal. Champions are focused on the goal. They don't have time to be doing stuff that's not going to help them toward the goal. We wake up and grind. Winners win. I focus on winning. Eye on the tiger. I want you to be so focused. I want you to be so concentrated that you block out all noise, that you block out all sound. You got to get to that point like you like that eagle. You know that eagle that's 100 and some odd feet in the air, and that eagle is flying around, and all of a sudden it looks down in the Atlantic Ocean and it sees its prey, and all of a sudden, bam! All that eagle does is one time, it brings out its wings. It shows its face toward where it's going. It puts its head down, and boom, it dives down. It doesn't look to the right. It doesn't look to the left. It doesn't look up. It doesn't look further down. It looks straight at its prey, and it goes, pow, straight down into the Atlantic Ocean. Straight down, eyes focused, arms out steady, and bam, it scoops up its prey, and it keeps on going. And I'm telling you, if you're going to blow up, if you're going to get to the next level, you got to stay focused. You got to learn how to concentrate. What makes a person average is their focus. And so what you're focusing on throughout the course of the day, it has to change. What you're looking at, what you're reading, what you're watching, the conversations you have. You must now be focused on your why, and you must be focused on your dreams. You must be focused on your goals. When you are great, you don't focus on a week. When you are great, you don't focus on a month. When you are great, you don't focus on a year. I'm not saying the same thing wrong with planning, but what I'm talking about is you concentrate on the 24 hours that's in front of you, and you nail it. I want you to focus on here right now. Don't you worry about when you get home. You concentrate on this opportunity. You don't worry about tomorrow. You concentrate on this opportunity with all your might, with all your soul, with all your heart. You focus on this, and tomorrow will take care of itself. If you would just believe that your day coming, that the sacrifices you are making today, they gonna pay off. But if you do not believe, it ain't gonna happen.
And that was motivating. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little meditation. And that was a little meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, this is the introduction to the book, The Collapse and the Fall of the Soviet Union.
Introduction. A puzzle. They finally got rid of him, that windbag. I heard this comment from fellow passengers on board an Aeroflot flight from Moscow to New York, which had just made a stop at Shannon, Ireland. It was the morning of 19 August, 1991, and it took me a few minutes to realize that these people were alluding to the removal of Mikhail Gorbachev from power. They had learned the news from CNN during the refueling stop, and they clearly approved of what they heard. The plane was full of Russians. Some of them were flying to conferences and diplomatic assignments. Most were going on private business, to see émigré relatives, and for other reasons. I was flying to the United States with several projects in mind. A few months earlier, I had begun working as a Russian aide for the journalist Strobe Talbot and historian Michael Beschloss, who were writing a book about the end of the Cold War. In my bag, I was carrying tapes, recording my interviews with Soviet officials. I had also decided to write my own book about the Soviet experience of the Cold War. The prestigious Amherst College in Massachusetts had offered me a fellowship to start my project, far from the turmoil of Moscow where I was born and had lived all my life up to that point. The news about Gorbachev's arrest was completely unexpected. As a young Moscow-based academic intellectual, I had been rooting for his reforms and liberalization in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev had evoked big expectations. Yet, since 1990, together with my friends, I had switched my allegiance to Boris Yeltsin, who sought a radical break with the old order. Nobody among the people I knew had any doubt that the old system, the Communist Party, centralized economic management, and the socialist choice were doomed. Still, no one wanted to storm the Kremlin and tear down the structures of the state. Everyone hoped for reform, not revolution. With my friends, I took part in democratic rallies, avidly read the work of economists who discussed how to return from a command economy to a market economy, and supported independence movements in Lithuania and Georgia. After my plane arrived at New York's JFK Airport, I bought a hefty copy of the New York Times. The newspaper informed me that Mikhail Gorbachev had apparently been ousted from power by the military and the KGB while on vacation in distant Crimea. During the fall of 1991, I worked in the library and archives of Amherst College, but spent more time reading and watching the news from home. The immense relief when the coup failed and Gorbachev returned to the Kremlin quickly gave way to anxiety about the future. The Soviet economy was in freefall. Ukraine and other republics intended to leave the Union. My mind was exploding in cognitive dissonance. I found myself a citizen of a state that was collapsing, and I could not share the excitement of American colleagues who joked that the USSR was now the union of fewer and fewer republics. Fortunately, my wife and son were staying with me in Amherst. Life went on, and at the end of September, my second son was born in a hospital in Northampton, Massachusetts. Yet a gnawing thought persisted. What sort of country would we be returning to? We never got back to the USSR. On a return flight, my plane landed at Sheremetyevo, Moscow on 31 December 1991, But by that time, the leaders of the Russian Federation, Ukraine, Belarus, and other republics had dissolved the Soviet Union. Gorbachev had resigned. The dimly lit Sheremetyevo airport was empty. Nobody to refuel the plane, nobody to operate a jet bridge, no customs officers, nobody even to check the passports and visas of arriving passengers. The new Russian state was the country of unprotected borders, without customs, with devalued currency and empty stores. The immutable state structure seemed to have evaporated. The country that I had left just a few months ago in August had suddenly vanished. For many years I wanted to write about the end of the Soviet Union, yet I believed more time should pass before more dispassionate attitudes to this epic event could be formed. I waited in vain. As memories of 1991 faded, opinions and myths acquired a life of their own. What was a provisional insight became an established view, immutable, just like the Soviet statehood had been before 1991. In the West, the Soviet collapse came to be universally accepted as predetermined and inevitable, something too self-evident to require further study. When in 2005, Russian President Vladimir Putin called the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, most Western observers ridiculed him for his reactionary nostalgia. It was the time of Western liberal triumphalism and the enlargement of NATO to the east. This mood changed after Russia's war with Georgia in 2008 and the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Western commentators began saying that Russia wanted to restore its lost empire. In 2019, the Polish head of the European Council, Donald Tusk, said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a blessing for Central and Eastern Europe, for Georgians, Poles, and Ukrainians. Only a few in the West recalled that the Russian Federation had been a leading actor in the Soviet dissolution. Mikhail Gorbachev remained the lonely hero in the West, since everyone acknowledged that he had set inevitable historical developments in motion. When Gorbachev supported Russia's annexation of Crimea, it was dismissed as an atypical pronouncement. In Russia, reactions to the Soviet collapse remain polarized. Liberal-minded people believe that the Soviet Union could not be reformed, and that even to write about its autopsy was a waste of time. Good riddance to the empire that could not give its people even bread and entertainment. Others feel nostalgia for Soviet greatness and think that Stalin was a great leader, while Gorbachev had sold out to the West. Some of them were not even born when the Soviet Union collapsed. Scholars who studied the end of the Soviet Union identified several causes of the state's demise. Their conclusions can be summarized as follows. First, the superiority of the United States and its policies in the Cold War had made the USSR retreat and surrender. Second, Gorbachev's glasnost had discredited both communist ideology and doomed the Soviet system to failure. Third, the Soviet Union had died because its economy imploded. Fourth, the movements for national independence had led to the implosion of the last empire. Finally, the most powerful Soviet elites had opposed Gorbachev's reforms, and thereby inadvertently caused the demise of the USSR. In this book, I argue that none of those causes, when taken separately, could have destroyed the Soviet Union, and it took me some time to understand how all those threads had converged in a kind of perfect storm unleashed by the rule of Mikhail Gorbachev. The literature about external Cold War pressures argues that the Soviet Union collapsed because it was overstretched. It lost the war in Afghanistan, carried the unbearable burden of military expenditures, and subsidized its clients around the world. The Soviet superpower, some scholars contend, could no longer compete militarily and technologically with the United States and its Western allies. Yet recently, scholars have concluded that U.S. pressures had little to do with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War. And, at least since 1987, Western governments were surprised and dismayed by the Soviet Union's destabilization and then disintegration. Recently, more nuanced studies of the Western, especially American, factor in the Soviet collapse have appeared. This book explores the external factors as secondary to the internal causes. International factors became crucial for shaping the behavior of the Soviet elites and counter-elites, but only after the Soviet Union had entered its terminal crisis. Glasnost, Gorbachev's policy of openness and transparency, and the media's attack on the communist past and ideology greatly contributed to the rise of anti-communist and nationalist movements. Yet it is not entirely clear what role ideological breakdown played in the disintegration of the Soviet statehood. For the Soviet elites, especially in Moscow, Stalin's crimes and repressions had long been known, and the majority of those in the party ranks, especially younger cohorts, had long been imitating socialist rhetoric, while acting on their real interests in a parallel universe of coveted foreign goods, travel, Western rock music, and mass culture. The party's ideological legitimacy had long been eroded, yet this was not the main reason why the party had ceded its economic and political levers of power in 1990 to 91. That was Gorbachev's decision, a voluntary and unprecedented devolution of power. The Soviet economic crisis played a central and often underestimated role in the last 3 years of Soviet history. In conjunction with revelations of past communist crimes, it contributed to mass discontent and mobilization against the central authority. It is axiomatic that the Soviet economic system was wasteful, ruinous, and could not deliver goods to people. What happened to the Soviet economy, however, remains a bone of contention. The oft-repeated explanations about the resistance of the party, the military-industrial complex, and other lobbies are not convincing. Scholars who studied the Soviet economy concluded that the Soviet economic system was destroyed not by its structural faults, but by Gorbachev-era reforms. The purposeful as well as unintended destruction of the Soviet economy, along with its finances, may be considered the best candidate as a principal cause of Soviet disintegration. This book is the first study of the Soviet collapse that pays closest attention to the economic and financial factors within a larger historical narrative. Some scholars wrote that the Soviet Union was the last empire bound to collapse along its multinational seams, just like other empires did. One authoritative study explains that nationalist movements began in Soviet borderlands, but then created enough resonance to mobilize the Russians in the core of the empire. The idea of secession from the Soviet Union became imaginable, and then began to appear inevitable. Mark Beisinger concludes that the multiple waves of nationalist revolt and interethnic violence overwhelmed the capacity of the Soviet state to defend itself. The breakup of the Soviet Union into 15 independent states along the borders of its republics made this explanation self-evident, yet deceptively circular. The paradigm of empire can be challenged. It exaggerates the role of the nationalist movements, especially in the Baltics and Ukraine, in the Soviet collapse. It also underplays the most crucial and amazing factor, the repeated failure of the central state to defend itself. And it gives a superficial explanation to the defection of the Russian Federation, the core of the Soviet Union. This book offers a more comprehensive look, distanced from the imperial paradigm, at why so many Russians in Moscow wished away so fervently the Soviet statehood that in many ways had been their form of existence for decades. Finally, there is the role played by the Soviet elites. Some scholars had already begun to question the old explanations of the reactionary and hardline nomenklatura, the system whereby influential posts in industry and government were filled by party appointees that had allegedly opposed Gorbachev and obstructed his reforms. In fact, evidence shows that Soviet bureaucrats and officials were amazingly adaptive. Some scholars have written about capitalist revolution, where Soviet nomenklatura abdicated the socialist project in order to grab national property for themselves. Others write about uncivil society, and the crumbling of the centralized pyramid of patronage lines crucial for state functioning. The attitudes of people in Soviet bureaucracies, in fact, varied from reactionary to liberal democratic. This book explores the changing outlook of the key Soviet elites in rapidly altering circumstances in a more fine-grained way than before. Above all, it dwells on their reactions to a failing economy, political anarchy, and ethno-national conflicts. Many threads in the analysis of the Soviet collapse overlapped and created a widespread feeling of doom, with the result that ultimately the event became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yet for a historian, this collapse presents a puzzle that does not quite click together. This puzzle became the main subject of this book. Gorbachev lies at the center of this puzzle. The personality and leadership of the last Soviet leader helps to bring together many pieces in the story of Soviet dissolution. Scholars who sympathize with Gorbachev usually foreground his international policies and give short shrift to his domestic problems and failures, ascribing the latter to intractable historical and other factors, as well as to the resistance and treason of his enemies. This approach has been consistent in the books of Archie Brown, perhaps the most influential Western interpreter of Gorbachev's policies. William Taubman, in his excellent biography of Gorbachev, finds faults in his hero, yet also refuses to call his reforms a failure. On the contrary, Taubman believes that Gorbachev laid the groundwork for democracy in the Soviet Union. It is more the fault of the raw material that he worked with than of his own shortcomings and mistakes that Russian democracy will take much longer to build than he thought. A leading Cold War historian, Odd Arnivestad, seems to agree. The final drama of the Cold War became a purely Soviet tragedy, he concludes. Gorbachev could have preserved the country by force, but he would rather see the Union disappear. The story of Gorbachev's best intentions and policies, however, begs for a realistic reassessment, with a more balanced exploration of social and economic dilemmas. After all, as wise people say, foreign policy begins at home, and one cannot claim a foreign triumph against the background of domestic chaos. Was Gorbachev a world visionary who was too good for his own country? This book draws international and domestic processes that affect the fate of the Soviet Union into one narrative. The book rethinks the inevitability of the Soviet collapse. It addresses questions. Which other policy options were available to the Kremlin? Could a smart use of coercion and incentives, resolute actions, and a bit of luck have made a difference? Were there other, much earlier choices and contingencies that, in the light of new evidence, constituted the points of no return? Many skeptics, when they heard me raising these questions, reproached me. The Soviet Union was doomed, they said, so one should celebrate its collapse, not interrogate it. Those arguments reminded me of what one scholar wrote about the Soviet collapse in 1993. We tend to confer the mantle of inevitability on accomplished facts, and arguing that what happened did not have to happen is likely to be dismissed as inventing excuses for the losing side. My book is not an exercise in how the evil empire could have been preserved. Rather, it is an attempt to be intellectually honest about what happened. History is never a sequence of inevitabilities, and the Soviet demise was no exception. It was full of contingencies. Unpredictability and uncertainty are fundamental features of human, state, and world affairs. Social movements and ideological currents are not rational, and political wills propel history in unexpected directions. Finally, there are accidents that have huge consequences. This last point resonated with me especially as I was finishing this book during the pandemic. The American diplomat George Kennan, author of The Doctrine of Containment, told his students at the National War College, Washington, in 1946 that the Soviet threat to the West could be removed by a gradual mellowing of Soviet policy under influence of firm and calm resistance abroad. Yet this mellowing, he warned, would be slow and never complete. Another, more radical option, Kennan wrote, was internal dissension, which would temporarily weaken Soviet potential and lead to a situation similar to that of 1919 to 20. Kennan did not consider this option likely, yet it describes quite well what happened to the Soviet Union in 1991. Nobody, including the most sagacious observers, could predict that the Soviet Union, which had survived the epic assault of Hitler's armies, would be defeated from within by its internal crises and conflict. During the 3 decades that followed World War II, the power of the USSR had grown immensely and seemed to prove its resilience. Western leaders and opinion makers spoke about a Soviet superpower, a rival of the United States in both economic and military potential. The CIA and many Western economists even forecast that the USSR would outpace the United States. In fact, the Soviet Union had always suffered from its economic and financial inferiority relative to the U.S. Its access to superpower status was enabled by a system that allowed the state's phenomenal concentration of resources to achieve a global projection of military might. This worked, however, only as long as the military power could be backed by a convincing ideological message and/or economic capacities. In the 1980s, when severe internal problems at the heart of the Soviet economy, its ideology, and society became apparent, Western observers feared that the Soviet Union might get a second wind. It did not. Yet even in 1990, the majority of observers in Moscow and elsewhere did not assume that the Soviet Union was doomed. Gorbachev and even his critics admit that without the coup of August 1991, the Soviet state would not have collapsed so quickly and thoroughly. In this book, I try to break free from the straitjacket of the dominant narrative that the Soviet collapse was inevitable, the narrative created in the West and within anti-communist circles inside the Soviet Union. That narrative is still in demand, but 30 years after the Soviet collapse, the audience has changed fundamentally. There are now as many people born after 1991 as those who had experienced and can remember the Soviet Union and the Cold War. Both audiences will find much that is new in this book. The history of the Soviet collapse was never a script known in advance. It was a drama of human ideals, fears, passions, and unanticipated developments. In this book, the listener will find many fly-on-the-wall episodes when Gorbachev and others in the Kremlin debated reforms, agonized over what to do with ethnic conflicts and seceding republics, and contested responsibility and power. To make the texture of the historical narrative authentic, I give preference to instantaneous reactions, rumors, and fears, rare moments of optimism, and frequent fits of despair that characterized those times. The book, without decentering Gorbachev, introduces more Soviet actors, voices, and initiatives. I argue that, taken together, they were much more than the Greek chorus to a purely Soviet tragedy hinging on Gorbachev's choices. Throughout the book, the cast of characters keeps widening and diversifying. As Gorbachev delegated central powers and replaced the old Soviet power hierarchy with an all-power-to-the-Soviet system, many people began to feel that they were not passive onlookers, but had become participants in history, if not its makers. And late Soviet politics was not just a duel between Gorbachev and his fateful rival, Yeltsin. The book presents a broad array of party stalwarts, reformers, economists, diplomats, parliamentary deputies, KGB officials, the military, captains of military-industrial corporations, budding entrepreneurs, journalists, the Baltic nationalists, the Ukrainian politicians, and many others. The book also reflects on the trajectory of the Western, and in particular the American, impact on the Soviet collapse, with government, non-governmental actors, and media playing an outsized role in Soviet imagination and politics. British and American sources, especially diaries and official dispatches, helped to fill gaps and correct numerous imprecisions in Soviet records. Foreigners, just like at the outset of the Soviet regime, became both chroniclers of and participants in Soviet history. In 1990 to 91, the U.S. administration, Congress, media, and non-governmental organizations became, willingly or unwillingly, participants in the radicalizing Soviet politics. The American factor loomed larger in the perceptions of those within the Soviet Union than Americans themselves ever suspected at the time. American soft power in the Soviet Union in 1990 to 91 was equal, if not greater, to what the United States had in Europe when it introduced the Marshall Plan of 1947. This American phenomenon in Soviet politics was far more complex than political meddling or interference. Those in Russia who continue to speculate about an American conspiracy to destroy the USSR do not know what they are talking about. Many in the Soviet Union welcomed and invited the Americans to come and help transform Soviet society. It is remarkable how narrow-minded and unimaginative, albeit prudent, the American leadership was in wielding their enormous soft power. The sources for this book have been collected over at least 3 decades. They include personal observations, many conversations with senior Soviet politicians, diplomats, military, KGB officers, officials from the military-industrial complex, and people from diverse walks of Soviet life, the state, and society. Archives and libraries in Russia and other countries provided me with what individual memories could not. Contrary to common perceptions in the West, Russian sources on the end of the Soviet Union are extraordinarily open, rich, and widely available through a number of electronic databases. Particularly valuable for history are numerous stenographic records of what happened in the institutions of Soviet power, on parliamentary floors, at the meetings of the radical opposition, at numerous conferences of experts and pundits. There is also a tapestry of personal records, minutes, letters, and diaries that often allow one to reconstruct events with remarkable precision and sense the spontaneity of the moment. The second biggest treasure trove for this book were sources and interviews in the United States. They were often more insightful and analytically profound than Soviet accounts. After all, no one entity observed unfolding events in the Soviet Union more attentively than its superpower rival. As I collected this evidence, I adjusted some of my pre-existing certainties and assumptions. I still believe, just like 30 years ago, that the central economy and Gorbachev's socialist choice were doomed. But I no longer have the same sense of inevitability about the party's demise. In general, I was surprised how clearly many people saw the separate strands of the approaching crisis, yet could not imagine that the whole state construction would fall apart. It was also surprising to see how many historical actors radically changed their views within a few years, influenced by political passions, fears, ideological illusions or delusions, and personal ambitions. Those changes provided an unmistakable sign of revolutionary times. Even well-known evidence looks different from a greater distance. The role of ideologies in the final phase of Soviet history looms larger to me now than when I was a witness to and participant in the events. When I was young, I dismissed Gorbachev's neo-Leninist proclamations as mere rhetoric. The evidence reveals that it was absolutely genuine and heartfelt. Equally striking for me today is the explosive spread of ideological anti-communism and American-style liberalism, especially in economics. At the time, it looked natural and a return to common sense. I also became struck by the utopian nature of the homegrown projects and ideas of reforms that sprang from the democratic-minded intelligentsia in Moscow and elsewhere. What looked like having no alternative then now appears to me as fanciful, naive, and a prognosis of catastrophe. This is not to criticize the actors of history with the wisdom of hindsight, but to historicize their motives and passions. My biggest surprise, however, came from my realization of the decisive and implacable role of money in the Soviet demise, something, given my Soviet background of economic ignorance, that I completely missed. At first, I wanted to start my account of the Soviet collapse in January 1991 and stay focused on month-by-month developments. Soon I realized, however, how crucial it was to explain to the listener, particularly the younger listener, the previous years of reforms, high hopes, mobilization of nationalism, impatience, and radicalization before they gave way to the frustration, fears, and resignation of 1991. My narrative now begins with Yuri Andropov in 1983, when the ex-KGB leader and General Secretary of the Communist Party, from 1982 to 84, had tacitly revived the idea of reforms from above. The first part of the book, chapters 1 through 6, explains how Gorbachev and his reform-minded entourage transformed the conservative reforms from above into a revolutionary gamble and ultimately removed the critical props on which the Soviet system and state were resting. In this part, I demonstrate how anti-systemic energy, accumulated by many years of Soviet one-party rule, had been magnified by Gorbachev's unsuccessful reforms and released into the domain of public politics. The second part of the book, chapters 7 through 15, covers the collapse itself. The book revisits familiar aspects of this story, but adds much new information that will be unfamiliar to the listener. I have completed this book with the conviction that the puzzle of the Soviet collapse is not a purely academic problem. In almost any conversation with Russians or Westerners alike in the years since 1991, they have reacted to my topic vividly and with curiosity. Why had Gorbachev, a prophet of change abroad, some asked, become an epitome of failure and ineffectiveness at home? Was there back then really a threat of a new dictatorship? Did Gorbachev's project of a new voluntary union of democratic states stand a chance of success? Was the new Russia that emerged in 1991 doomed to return to authoritarianism, or was there a missed opportunity? I hope this book will satisfy this curiosity and arm the listener with a much better understanding of a great geopolitical and economic upheaval, one that gave birth to a new world.
And that was the introduction of Collapse, The Fall of the Soviet Union by Vladimir Zubak. And it's read by David DeFries. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.